Wolf freezes with 2 pups outside a women's door. What happens next will shock you. Sarah Morgan stood at her kitchen window, watching snowflakes dance in the bitter January wind. The thermometer outside read -15 degrees, another record-breaking cold night in Montana. Her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that had long gone cold, much like the emptiness that had settled in her chest since Robert's passing 6 months ago. The clock in the living room struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the silent house. Sarah winced at the sound. Robert had loved that clock, spent countless weekends maintaining its ancient mechanisms. Now its steady ticking only reminded her of all the moments they would never share. A movement in the darkness caught her eye. At first, she dismissed it as another shadow cast by the swaying pine trees that surrounded her isolated cabin. But then she saw it again, more deliberate this time. Sarah leaned closer to the frost-kissed window, squinting into the darkness. A large, dark shape emerged from the tree line, moving slowly through the knee-deep snow. As it approached the warm glow of her porch light, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was a wolf, but something about its movement seemed wrong. It stumbled, nearly falling face first into the snow, before regaining its balance. "Oh my God!" Sarah whispered, pressing her hand against the cold glass. The wolf's coat, which should have been thick and full for winter, hung in matted clumps. Its sides heaved with each labored breath, creating small clouds in the frigid air. But what made Sarah's heart truly stop was what followed behind the struggling animal. 2 tiny wolf pups, barely visible against the white snow, trembling violently as they tried to keep pace with their mother. The trio reached her porch steps, and to Sarah's astonishment, the mother wolf collapsed, curling her body around her shivering pups. One of the pups let out a pitiful whine that carried through the walls of the cabin, striking something deep within Sarah's chest. "Don't get involved," she told herself firmly, stepping away from the window. Robert had always warned her about wild animals, especially wolves. "They're not pets, Sarah," he'd say, particularly when they'd spot them from a distance during their hiking trips. "They're survivors, and they're dangerous when cornered." But as she paced her kitchen, that whimper kept playing in her mind. The temperature was dropping further. The weather report had warned of an unprecedented cold snap. Those pups wouldn't survive the night. Sarah ran her fingers through her graying hair, conflict written across her face. "This is crazy," she muttered, even as she found herself pulling on her heavy winter boots and coat. Her hand hesitated on the door handle, common sense warring with compassion. Another whimper, weaker this time, made the decision for her. She opened the door slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The mother wolf's head snapped up, yellow eyes locking onto Sarah with an intensity that made her freeze. But there was something in those eyes that Sarah hadn't expected, not aggression or fear, but exhaustion, and what looked remarkably like desperation. "Hey there," Sarah said softly, crouching down to appear less threatening. "You're in quite a situation, aren't you?" The wolf made no move to attack or retreat. Instead, it looked down at its pups, then back at Sarah, letting out a soft whine of its own. The sound sent chills down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "I must be out of my mind," Sarah whispered, slowly standing up. "Okay, listen. I'm going to help you, but you have to trust me. Can you do that?" As if understanding her words, the wolf struggled to its feet, nudging its pups towards Sarah's open door. One of the pups stumbled, too weak to walk, and Sarah's heart clenched. Without thinking, she stepped forward and gently scooped up the fallen pup. The mother wolf watched intently but made no aggressive move. The pup in her arms was terrifyingly cold, its tiny heart beating rapidly against her palm. "Come on," she urged the mother and remaining pup, holding the door wider. "Please." To her amazement, they followed her inside. The warm air hit them like a wall, and Sarah quickly closed the door behind them, shutting out the howling wind. She grabbed every spare blanket she could find, creating a makeshift nest in the corner of her living room, as far from the fireplace as possible to not overwhelm them with the heat change. As she placed the pup she was holding onto the blankets, she noticed something that made her gasp. Hidden beneath the matted fur on its neck was a crude bandage, dirty but deliberately placed. She looked more closely at the mother wolf and saw similar signs of human intervention: old bandages, partially healed wounds that had been treated. "You've been through something, haven't you?" Sarah murmured, her mind racing with questions. "Someone was taking care of you. What happened to them?" The mother wolf settled onto the blankets, pulling both pups close. Their shivering gradually subsided as the room's warmth seeped into their frozen bodies. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, maintaining a respectful distance as she observed her unexpected guests. The clock struck 1, and Sarah realized she had just invited 3 wild wolves into her home. Robert would have thought she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. But as she watched the mother wolf tenderly cleaning her pups, Sarah felt something stir in her heart, something she thought had died along with Robert. It was purpose, mixed with a hefty dose of curiosity about the mystery these wolves brought with them. "Well," she said quietly, more to herself than her new companions, "I guess we'll figure this out together." The mother wolf's eyes met hers again, and in that moment, Sarah felt the weight of a connection she couldn't explain. Whatever had brought these wolves to her door on this coldest of nights, she knew with certainty that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Dawn crept through the windows, painting Sarah's living room in soft, golden hues. She hadn't slept, too captivated by her unusual guests. The mother wolf hadn't moved from her spot all night, except to occasionally adjust her position around the pups. What struck Sarah most was how the wolf's eyes never fully closed, always watching, always alert, despite her obvious exhaustion. "You need to eat something," Sarah said softly, placing a bowl of water and another filled with leftover pot roast near the blanket nest. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd barely touched food herself these past months, and here she was, trying to coax a wild animal to eat. The wolf's nostrils flared at the scent of meat, but she made no move toward it. Instead, she nudged the smallest pup, the one Sarah had carried in, toward the food. The pup stumbled forward, sniffing cautiously before taking small, hungry bites. Its siblings soon followed, but the mother remained still, watching. Sarah frowned. "The food's for you too, you know." She pushed the bowl closer, but the wolf turned her head away, focusing instead on cleaning her pups as they ate. Throughout the day, Sarah observed similar behavior. She'd bring fresh water and more food, chicken, beef, even some salmon she'd been saving, but the mother wolf refused it all, ensuring her pups ate first. Each time, Sarah noticed how the wolf's ribs became more prominent under her matted fur, how her eyes grew more sunken. By afternoon, Sarah couldn't stand it anymore. She sat down on the floor, maintaining the careful distance they'd established. "You're going to starve yourself at this rate," she said, surprising herself with the crack in her voice. "Trust me, I know something about that." Her eyes drifted to the untouched casserole dish in her kitchen, brought over by well-meaning neighbors 3 days ago. She hadn't been able to bring herself to eat it. Food had lost its appeal since Robert's accident, becoming merely a necessity she forced herself to face occasionally. A soft whine drew her attention back to the wolf. For the first time, the animal had moved away from her pups, taking a tentative step towards Sarah. In the daylight, Sarah could better see the extent of the wolf's condition. Besides the old bandages, there were half-healed scratches along her flanks, and her fur was missing in patches, revealing scars that spoke of recent battles. "What happened to you?" Sarah whispered. "Who took care of you before? And why?" Her voice trailed off as she noticed something peculiar. Around the wolf's neck, nearly hidden by fur, was a worn leather cord. Not a collar, but something more deliberate, more personal. The wolf allowed Sarah to inch closer, their eyes locked in what felt like mutual understanding. With trembling fingers, Sarah gently parted the fur around the cord. There, hanging from it, was a small wooden pendant, carved with intricate symbols she didn't recognize. "Someone loved you," Sarah realized aloud. "Someone treated your wounds, gave you this, protected you. But something went wrong, didn't it?" As if in response, the wolf let out a low, mournful sound that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. The pups, now fed and warmer, crawled over to their mother, pressing against her sides. The smaller one, Sarah had started thinking of it as Tiny, nuzzled at a particularly nasty scar on the wolf's shoulder, causing her to flinch. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. The bandages, though dirty now, had been professionally applied. The pendant spoke of Native American craftsmanship. Could the wolf have belonged to someone from the reservation 20 miles north? But that didn't explain why she was now here, starving and wounded, with 2 pups to protect. Standing up, Sarah walked to her bookshelf and pulled out Robert's old wildlife journal. He'd been an amateur naturalist, documenting the behavior patterns of local wildlife. She flipped through the pages until she found his notes on wolves. Wolves typically hunt in packs, she read aloud. A lone wolf, especially a mother with pups, separated from her pack faces significantly reduced chances of survival. She looked up at the wolf, who was watching her intently. You're not just separated from your pack, are you? You're running from something. The wolf's ears flattened against her head, and she pulled her pups closer. Sarah had spent enough time around animals during her 20 years in Montana to know fear when she saw it. This wasn't just a mother protecting her young. This was a refugee seeking sanctuary. Sarah's own loss suddenly felt different in light of this revelation. She'd spent months hiding in her grief, pushing away anyone who tried to help. But this wolf, despite everything she'd been through, despite her obvious fear and exhaustion, had found the courage to seek help when her pups needed it. Okay, Sarah said firmly, closing the journal. Here's what we're going to do. She went to the kitchen and returned with the untouched casserole. She sat down closer to the wolves than before and took a bite, then placed a portion on the floor for the mother wolf. We eat together, she declared. Both of us. Because both of us need to survive, and neither of us can do it alone anymore. The wolf studied her for a long moment, her intelligent eyes seeming to weigh Sarah's words. Then, slowly, she leaned forward and began to eat. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, though she couldn't exactly say why. Perhaps it was the simple act of sharing a meal, something she hadn't done since Robert died. Or perhaps it was the recognition that healing sometimes comes in the strangest forms. As the afternoon light began to fade, Sarah noticed the wolf growing restless. She would pace to the window, then back to her pups, her movements becoming increasingly agitated. Something was bothering her, something beyond hunger or fear. What is it? Sarah asked, watching as the wolf returned to the window for the 5th time. What are you looking for? The wolf turned to her, and in that moment, Sarah saw something in those yellow eyes that made her heart race. There was urgency there, and beneath it, a silent plea. Whatever had brought this wolf to her door, Sarah realized, was only the beginning of a much bigger story. The next morning dawned gray and forbidding, with fresh snow blanketing the landscape. Sarah woke from her makeshift bed on the couch. She hadn't wanted to leave her guests alone during the night, to find the mother wolf already at the door, pawing gently at the wood. You need to go out? Sarah asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. But this was different from the wolf's previous trips outside. There was an intensity to her movements that Sarah hadn't seen before, a deliberate purpose in the way she looked back at Sarah, then at the door, then back again. The pups were stronger now, their night of warmth and food having restored some of their vigor. Even Tiny, who had worried Sarah the most, was standing steadily on its feet. The mother wolf approached Sarah, and to her amazement, gently gripped her sleeve with her teeth, tugging her toward the door. You want me to follow you? Sarah asked incredulously. The wolf released her sleeve and nodded, actually nodded, in a way that seemed far too human. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She thought about Robert again, about what he would say. Sometimes animals know things we don't. He told her once, after they'd watched a herd of elk unexpectedly change their migration route, avoiding an avalanche that came down hours later. The trick is being humble enough to listen. Okay, Sarah said, pulling on her heaviest winter gear. But the pups stay here where it's warm. She created a secure nest of blankets near the fireplace, making sure they had water within reach. The mother wolf seemed to understand, nuzzling her pups into the blankets before turning to the door with renewed urgency. Sarah grabbed her emergency pack, something Robert had insisted they always keep ready, containing first aid supplies, some food, a flashlight, and other essentials. As they stepped outside, the cold hit Sarah like a physical blow. The wolf, however, seemed energized by it, moving with purpose through the deep snow. She would go ahead a few yards, then wait for Sarah to catch up, always making sure she was following. They traveled deeper into the forest than Sarah had gone in months. The trees grew thicker here, their branches heavy with snow, creating an eerie tunnel effect. Sarah recognized landmarks from her hikes with Robert: the lightning-struck oak, the peculiar rock formation they'd called the Sleeping Giant. But everything looked different under winter's harsh grip. After about an hour of trudging through the snow, the wolf's behavior changed. She slowed down, moving more cautiously, her ears constantly swiveling to catch any sound. Sarah found herself mimicking the wolf's careful movements, though she wasn't sure why. That's when she heard it, a sound so faint she almost missed it. A whimper, but not from her companion. It came from somewhere ahead, barely audible over the wind. The wolf looked back at her, and Sarah saw something like approval in those intelligent eyes. They continued forward, more slowly now, until they reached a steep embankment partially hidden by fallen logs. The wolf disappeared behind one of the logs, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah followed. What she found made her gasp. Hidden beneath the embankment was a natural cave formation, its entrance cleverly concealed by the fallen timber. As her eyes adjusted to the dimness, Sarah saw movement inside. Lots of movement. "Oh my God!" she whispered. In the cave, huddled together for warmth, were several young animals. A young deer, barely more than a fawn, lay curled up with what appeared to be 3 fox kits. Nearby, 2 young rabbits pressed against each other, their ears twitching at Sarah's voice. And in the corner, partially hidden behind a rock, she spotted the unmistakable shape of a young mountain lion cub. But what struck Sarah most was that each animal bore similar signs to what she'd seen on the wolf: careful bandaging, treated wounds, signs of human care. The fawn had a splinted leg, professionally wrapped. The mountain lion cub had stitches visible along its flank. "This is impossible," Sarah breathed. "They should be trying to eat each other." Yet here they were, coexisting peacefully. All of them young, all of them injured, all of them bearing the same signs of human intervention. The wolf moved through the cave, checking on each animal with a gentleness that defied explanation. The young animals showed no fear of her. If anything, they seemed to take comfort in her presence. Sarah watched in amazement as the wolf gently cleaned the mountain lion cub's wound, just as she would tend to her own pups. "You've been caring for them," Sarah realized, her voice thick with emotion. "That's why you're so thin. You've been hunting for all of them, haven't you?" The wolf looked at her, and in that moment, Sarah understood why she'd been brought here. This wasn't just a den, it was a sanctuary. Someone had created it, someone who knew how to treat injured wildlife. But something had happened to that person, and now the wolf was trying to keep their work alive, even at the cost of her own survival. A glint of metal caught Sarah's eye. In the back of the cave, partially covered by leaves, was a metal box. Her hands trembling, Sarah reached for it. Inside, she found medical supplies, bandages, antibiotic ointment, even a small suture kit, along with a weathered notebook. But before she could open it, a sound from outside the cave made the wolf's head snap up. All the animals in the cave went still, and Sarah felt her heart begin to race. The wolf moved to the cave entrance, her posture tense, a low growl building in her throat. Through the gaps in the fallen logs, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement, something large, something that didn't belong in these woods. The wolf looked back at her, and Sarah saw fear in those yellow eyes, not for herself, but for the vulnerable creatures in her care. Whatever was out there, it was what the wolf had been running from, what had perhaps taken away the person who had created this sanctuary. And now, Sarah realized with a mix of terror and determination, she was part of this story too. The wolf hadn't just shown her this place for help, she'd shown her because she needed an ally in whatever battle she was fighting. The sound grew closer, and Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The wolf's hackles rose, her teeth bared in a silent snarl. Through the gaps in the fallen logs, Shadows moved, too organized, too deliberate to be natural forest creatures. Sarah pressed herself against the cave wall, clutching the metal box. With trembling fingers, she opened the notebook she'd found inside. The first page made her breath catch. Wildlife Rehabilitation Project, Dr. Emily Anderson, Cherokee Nation Wildlife Service. Footsteps crunched in the snow outside, and voices carried on the wind, human voices. The wolf's growl deepened, but Sarah noticed something strange. The animal wasn't showing the sort of fear you'd expect if these were the threats she'd been running from. Instead, she seemed uncertain. "The tracks lead this way," a woman's voice called out. "Fresh ones, heading toward the old cave system." The wolf's ears perked up at the voice, her growl fading to a whine of recognition. Before Sarah could react, the wolf darted out through the cave entrance. Sarah heard gasps then. "Spirit? Oh my God, Spirit!" Cautiously, Sarah peered through the logs. What she saw made her jaw drop. The wolf, Spirit, was practically dancing around a Native American woman in her 50s, her tail wagging like a pet dog's. Behind the woman stood two men in wildlife service uniforms, looking equally amazed. "Dr. Anderson?" Sarah called out, emerging from the cave. I think I found your sanctuary." The woman turned, her weathered face creasing with surprise. "And who might you be?" Sarah explained everything, finding Spirit and her pups at her door, following her to the cave, discovering the hidden animal sanctuary. As she spoke, Dr. Anderson's expression shifted from surprise to understanding to relief. "So they survived," she breathed, looking at Spirit with tears in her eyes. "When they attacked our facility, I feared." "Attacked?" Sarah asked. "Who attacked?" Dr. Anderson's face darkened. "Poachers. They hit our main rehabilitation center 2 weeks ago. Spirit was our most unique case, a wolf who helped us care for other animals. She has a gift, a connection with them that defies explanation. When the poachers came, she led the most vulnerable animals away while we held them off." The pieces started falling into place in Sarah's mind. "The bandages, the treatments, you were caring for all these animals at your facility?" "Yes," Dr. Anderson nodded. "We specialize in rehabilitating injured wildlife, particularly young animals who've lost their parents to poaching or accidents. Spirit came to us 3 years ago, badly injured from a trap. But as she healed, we discovered she had this extraordinary capacity for gentleness with other animals. She became our unofficial assistant, helping calm new arrivals, even watching over them when we couldn't." Sarah looked at the wolf with new understanding. "But why didn't she come back to you after the attack?" One of the wildlife officers spoke up. "The poachers were tracking her specifically. They'd heard rumors about a wolf that could control other animals. They thought..." He hesitated, looking embarrassed. "They thought she had magical properties. There's a black market for that kind of thing. Spirit led them away from the facility." Dr. Anderson continued. "She must have gathered as many of the young animals as she could and found this cave. We've been searching for 2 weeks, but the snowstorm covered her tracks. Until now." Sarah watched as Spirit moved back into the cave, checking on each animal before returning to Dr. Anderson's side. "But what about her pups?" "They're at my cabin." Dr. Anderson's eyes widened. "Pups? Spirit didn't have." She turned to the wolf. "You found them, didn't you? That's why you weren't just hiding in the cave. You were looking for help." Spirit wagged her tail, then looked at Sarah with those intelligent eyes that had first convinced her to open her door on that freezing night. "The poachers," Sarah said slowly. "They're still out there?" "We caught 2 of them," the other officer replied. "But their leader, a man named Kane, is still at large. He's obsessed with Spirit, convinced she's some kind of spirit animal that can give him power over the forest creatures." Sarah thought about the pendant around Spirit's neck. "The necklace, did you give that to her?" Dr. Anderson touched it gently. "It's a Cherokee protection charm. My grandmother made it for her. Spirit's never taken it off." She looked around the cave, taking in the surviving animals. We need to move them all to our backup facility. It's smaller, but it's secure. As they began preparing to transport the animals, Sarah felt a deep sadness well up inside her. She'd only known Spirit and her pups for a day, but the thought of saying goodbye already hurt. Spirit seemed to sense her emotions. She pressed against Sarah's leg, looking up at her with those extraordinary eyes. You know, Dr. Anderson said thoughtfully, our backup facility is only about 5 miles from your cabin. We could use someone with your compassion on our team. Someone who understands that sometimes the most wounded creatures are the ones most capable of healing others. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she remembered how Spirit had refused to eat until she did, how they had helped each other find strength. I'd like that, she whispered. Besides, Dr. Anderson smiled. Spirit seems to have chosen you as part of her pack now. And she's an excellent judge of character. As they worked together to carefully move the animals, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death: purpose. She looked at Spirit, who moved between helping with the other animals and checking on the rescuers, and understood something profound. Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones you can bandage, and sometimes the greatest healers come in the most unexpected forms. But their work wasn't finished. Somewhere out there, Cain was still hunting Spirit. And Sarah knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she would do whatever it took to protect this extraordinary wolf and the sanctuary she had helped preserve. The mountain lion cub growled softly as they lifted its carrier, and Spirit immediately moved to comfort it. Sarah watched in amazement as the predator relaxed under the wolf's gentle attention. How is this possible? She asked Dr. Anderson. The older woman smiled mysteriously. There are things in this world that science can't explain, Sarah. Sometimes we just have to accept the magic when we see it. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The backup facility, a converted ranch house tucked away in the foothills, became her second home. Dr. Anderson, Emily, as she insisted Sarah call her, turned out to be an incredible mentor, sharing her vast knowledge of wildlife rehabilitation with the same patience Spirit showed to her injured charges. Sarah's cabin, being so close to the facility, became an unofficial observation post. Spirit would often lead her pups there, now strong enough to make the journey, and Sarah found herself looking forward to their visits. The smaller pup, Tiny, had developed a particular attachment to her, often falling asleep in her lap while she read Robert's wildlife journals. One evening, as Sarah was helping Emily change the mountain lion cub's bandages, she noticed something peculiar. The marking on its flank, she said, pointing to a distinctive pattern in the fur. I've seen that before. Emily tensed slightly. Where? In Robert's journals. Sarah rushed to get the book she now carried everywhere. Flipping through the pages, she found what she was looking for. Here, he spotted a female mountain lion with the same marking 3 months ago. He was worried because he'd seen poachers in the area. Emily studied the detailed sketch Robert had made. Sarah, this could be crucial information. If this cub belongs to the lion your husband observed, it could help us build a stronger case against Cain. He's been targeting specific bloodlines, animals he believes have special qualities. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. You mean like Spirit? Exactly. Emily glanced at the wolf, who was currently helping one of the officers coax a frightened fox kit into taking its medicine. Cain believes certain animals are touched by old magic. He sells them to collectors who share his twisted beliefs. Sarah watched Spirit work her gentle magic with the fox kit, and fury built in her chest. The thought of someone hunting this extraordinary creature for profit made her angry. But anger, she had learned from her grief counselor, could be channeled into action. Robert's journals, she said suddenly. He documented everything he saw in these woods for 20 years. Every animal, every poacher activity, every unusual behavior. There might be more information that could help. Emily's eyes lit up. Could you go through them? Map out patterns, identify areas where Cain might be operating? I'll do better than that, Sarah replied, a plan forming in her mind. Robert didn't just write things down. He had cameras, trail cameras he set up all over these woods. Some of them might still be working. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She spread Robert's journals across her living room floor, Spirit and her pups watching curiously as she created a timeline of suspicious activities. The wolf seemed to understand the importance of their work, occasionally nosing at particular pages as if trying to help. "You know," Sarah said to Spirit, "I used to think I was just existing after Robert died. Going through the motions." She reached out to scratch behind the wolf's ears, something that had become natural over the past weeks. "But you showed me there's always purpose to be found, even in pain." Spirit's eyes, wise and gentle, met hers, and Sarah felt that now familiar connection strengthen. This wolf had lost her pack, had been hunted and wounded, yet she turned her trauma into a mission to protect others. Sarah realized she could do the same with her grief. The next morning, Sarah presented her findings to Emily and the wildlife officers. She'd identified 3 likely locations where Kane might be operating, based on Robert's detailed observations of disturbed wildlife patterns and suspicious human activity. "There's more," she said, pulling out a map Robert had marked. "These are the locations of all his trail cameras. 15 in total. If even a few of them are still working, we could catch Kane in the act." Emily finished, excitement in her voice. "Sarah, this is incredible." They organized into teams to check the cameras. Spirit, despite Emily's concerns about her safety, insisted on accompanying Sarah's group. The wolf's protective instincts had only grown stronger since they moved the animals to the backup facility. At the 4th camera location, they struck gold. Not only was the camera still functioning, but its memory card was full of images. Sarah's hands trembled as they reviewed the footage back at the facility. "Stop," Emily said sharply, pointing at the screen. "There." The image showed a man moving through the woods at night, carrying what looked like specialized tracking equipment. His face was clearly visible in the camera's infrared mode. "That's Kane," one of the officers confirmed. "And this was taken just 3 days ago." Sarah felt Spirit press against her leg, a low growl rumbling in the wolf's chest. The image shifted to show Kane setting up what appeared to be traps, cruel devices designed to capture large predators alive. "He's not giving up," Emily said quietly. "He's obsessed with Spirit, convinced she's the key to controlling all the animals in these woods." Sarah looked down at Spirit, at the protection charm that still hung around her neck, at the intelligence and compassion in her eyes. "Maybe she is special," she said. "Just not in the way he thinks." That night, as Sarah updated her analysis with the new information, she realized something had changed within her. The paralyzing grief that had consumed her for months had transformed into something else, not gone, but different. Like Spirit's wounds, it had healed into scars that made her stronger, more determined. She looked at the wolf family dozing by her fireplace, Spirit and her pups, safe and content, and understood that sometimes the greatest healing comes from having something to protect. Robert had devoted his life to documenting and protecting these woods and their inhabitants. Now Sarah would continue that legacy, but with a new partner at her side. "We're going to stop him," she promised Spirit softly. "And then we're going to make sure no one ever hurts your family again." Spirit lifted her head and met Sarah's gaze with that uncanny intelligence. In that moment, Sarah felt the full weight of their connection, 2 wounded souls who had found purpose in protecting others, in turning their pain into power. The grandfather clock struck midnight, its sound no longer a reminder of loss but a call to action. Tomorrow, they would take their evidence to the authorities. Tomorrow, they would begin the final phase of protecting Spirit and her sanctuary. But tonight, Sarah allowed herself to simply exist in this moment of peace, surrounded by the family she never expected to find, preparing for a battle she never expected to fight. Spring arrived in Montana with a gentle persistence, melting away the harsh winter that had brought Spirit into Sarah's life. The woods around the sanctuary buzzed with new life, but Sarah remained vigilant. They hadn't caught Kane yet, though the evidence from Robert's cameras had led to the arrest of 3 more members of his poaching ring. One sunny morning, as Sarah completed her rounds at the sanctuary, she noticed Spirit acting strangely. The wolf paced restlessly, looking toward the woods with unusual intensity. Over the months, Sarah had learned to trust Spirit's instincts. "Emily," she called out. "Something's wrong." Before Emily could respond, Spirit bolted into the trees. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her emergency pack and followed, her boots pounding against the newly thawed earth. Behind her, she heard Emily radioing the wildlife officers. Spirit led her through familiar paths, past the cave where they'd first discovered the hidden sanctuary, deeper into the woods than they'd gone before. Suddenly, the wolf stopped, her ears perked forward. Sarah heard it too, the sound of an engine, out of place in these protected woods. They crept forward carefully until they reached a small clearing. There, partially hidden under camouflage netting, was a truck. Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she saw the cages in the back, and what was inside them. "Cubs," she whispered in horror. 3 mountain lion cubs, likely from the same bloodline as the one they'd rescued months ago. And they weren't alone. Other cages held wolf pups, fox kits, even a young black bear. Spirit growled softly, and Sarah turned to see what had caught her attention. Through the trees, she spotted movement, a man approaching the truck with another cage. Even from this distance, she recognized Kane from the trail camera photos. Sarah reached for her phone to alert Emily, but before she could, Spirit did something unexpected. The wolf stepped into the clearing, fully exposing herself to Kane. "Spirit, no!" Sarah whispered urgently, but she understood. Spirit was offering herself as a distraction, protecting Sarah just as she protected all vulnerable creatures in her care. Kane's face lit up with an unsettling gleam. "Finally," he breathed, setting down the cage he was carrying. "Do you know how long I've been waiting for you?" Spirit stood her ground, her yellow eyes fixed on Kane, her posture revealing none of the gentleness Sarah knew she possessed. She was every inch the wild predator now, buying time as Sarah heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching. "All these months," Kane continued, slowly reaching for something in his jacket, "I've watched you. The way the other animals follow you, trust you. You're the key to everything." He pulled out what looked like a tranquilizer gun. "And now you're going to help me control them all." Sarah couldn't wait any longer. She stepped out of her hiding place, Robert's old hunting rifle steady in her hands. "Drop it, Kane!" His face twisted with anger. "You don't understand what she is. What she can do. I understand better than you ever will." Sarah replied, her voice firm. "Spirit doesn't control other animals. She protects them. She heals them. She shows them kindness, something you wouldn't recognize if it bit you." "Kindness?" Kane laughed bitterly. "Nature isn't kind. It's about power, about." He never finished his sentence. Spirit, seeing him start to raise his gun towards Sarah, launched herself at him. But instead of attacking, she did something more powerful. She knocked the weapon from his hand and stood between him and Sarah, displaying not aggression but protection. At that moment, Emily and the wildlife officers burst into the clearing, weapons drawn. Kane, realizing he was surrounded, tried to run but was quickly tackled and restrained. As they led him away, Sarah heard him muttering about spirit animals and ancient powers. "He never understood," Emily said, coming to stand beside Sarah as they watched the officers freeing the captured animals. "Spirit's power was never about control. It was about choice. She chooses to help, to heal, to protect. That's a kind of magic Kane could never possess." Spirit padded over to investigate the freed cubs, gently nosing them toward one of the sanctuary's transport vehicles. Her own pups, now almost full-grown, emerged from the trees where they'd been watching, ready to help their mother as they'd been taught. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she watched them work. "Robert would have loved this," she said softly. "He always said nature had more to teach us than we could ever learn in a lifetime." Emily squeezed her shoulder. "He'd be proud of you, Sarah. You turned your grief into purpose, just like Spirit turned her injuries into a mission to help others." Later that evening, as the sun set over the sanctuary, Sarah sat on her cabin's porch, Spirit and her family sprawled contentedly around her. The rescued cubs had been reunited with their mother, another success story for their growing sanctuary. Sarah pulled out Robert's journal one last time, but not to look for evidence or track poacher activities. Instead, she turned to the blank pages at the back and began to write. Today, we ended a chapter that began on the coldest night of winter, when a wolf with 2 pups taught me that healing isn't just about surviving, it's about helping others survive too. Spirit showed me that our wounds don't have to define us. They can inspire us to prevent others from being wounded in the same way. She looked down at Spirit, who had rested her head on Sarah's lap. The protection charm still hung around her neck, but it seemed to glow with a different meaning now. It wasn't just about protecting Spirit anymore. It was about the protection she offered to others. The sanctuary is growing, Sarah continued writing. More animals coming in, more being rehabilitated and released. Spirit oversees it all, and I've learned to trust her judgment more than any human expert. She knows which animals need space and which need comfort, which are ready to return to the wild and which need more time to heal. The grandfather clock chimed inside the cabin, and for the first time in over a year, Sarah smiled at the sound. Time wasn't just marking loss anymore, it was measuring growth, healing, and new beginnings. Robert always said every creature has a purpose, she wrote in conclusion. Spirit's purpose found her when she was most wounded, and in helping her fulfill it, I found mine too. Sometimes the deepest healing comes not from being cared for, but from learning to care for others. In the end, that's the most powerful magic of all. As the last light faded from the sky, Sarah closed the journal and looked out over the sanctuary that had become her life's work. Spirit's pups played in the twilight, strong and confident now, ready to carry on their mother's legacy of protection and healing. The cycle would continue, turning wounds into wisdom, loss into love, and grief into growth, one rescued soul at a time.